You're listening to Freight Famous, presented by Rose Rocket, bringing you the people that make trucking move. From behind the scenes into the limelight. Here's your host, Justin Bailie.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Freight Famous, a podcast produced by Rose Rocket. Before I introduce our guest today, I want to tell you about Rose Rocket's TMS referral program. If someone you know is looking for a TMS, Rose Rocket would love to have you join our incentivized referral program. To learn more, email us at referralpartners@roserocket.com. I'm your host, Justin Bailie, co-founder at Rose Rocket. Today we have Thomas Deakins. He's a director of Global Supply Chain Institute at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, as well as a founder and managing director of Thomas Deakins Consulting. So Thomas has worked at a bunch of different places. He's got 30 years experience, P44, Oracle, Trimble, Mercury Gate, just to name a few. In our show today, Thomas talks about how data is the new oil. Really, really love that. Agile supply chains. And talks a little bit about, a topic that I'm quite interested in, and how sustainability in trucking specifically is not total bullshit. Thomas, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me in, Justin. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. So I'd love to just hear a little bit about how one becomes, your background, some of the places you've worked. You've got extensive experience here. How did you end up where you are today? What brought you here?
Yeah, so I think, man, I'm old, right? So I'm going to date back to 1992. When I had my first job in, I guess you would say, transportation at the time, because the word supply chain had not even been coined yet. And so I was an undergrad at the University of Tennessee, and I started working the summer at UPS. And that might be the hardest job I've ever had from a physical standpoint, because I loaded trucks. And man, it was, the first 2 weeks, give you an idea, I lost 20 pounds. And
Wow.
Yeah, just moving boxes. Think about trailers sitting out in the heat all day long in the summer. You open up that trailer, get blasted by the sauna, and then you just start, UPS is fast, right?
Man, that's like there's a YouTube, a lot of money for you to be made on like how to lose 20 pounds in 2 weeks. Like you have 1 million followers waiting for you right now.
I know. I mean, just go to work for UPS.
Exactly.
Back then it was $8 an hour. It's not the stuff they just negotiated, right?
That's right. Right.
And that kind of gave me my first foray into transportation. And then I worked in the LTL for an LTL carrier at night, put my way through school and rating freight bills. And so, that was back before we really had automatic rating systems, and we were literally looking at the rates, and I'd look at a freight bill and I'd say, oh, that drum that they're moving on this freight bill is not class 80, it should be class 55. And then if you didn't know, you'd have to go look in a book, and you would have to run these big rate ponies. It was, stacks of paper like this, right?
Yeah.
And so, but my first job out of college, I continued on in transportation, was with J.B. Hunt. I went through their management training program, everything to learning to drive, had to get my CDL. They had a great training program because their belief is that if you're going to dispatch drivers or you're going to plan drivers on the logistics side, you need to understand what a driver went through.
That's great.
So they literally put us out on the road for 2 weeks.
Wow.
And I just became, enamored with technology over time. And I decided to make the switch. So I worked for Chet Pilots and some other companies on the logistics side. But then when I got exposed to my first technology system, that I knew right then in the supply chain arena, that's where I wanted to go. And again, supply chain, that word didn't even exist. It was either transportation or logistics. And so oddly enough, I went to work for SAP and started doing implementations of the system. And, we saved the world, right? Because Y2K was coming, and, we saved the world. We kept the systems able to go to zero, right? And I say that very when I'm joking.
Yeah, it also, and I think a lot of the software companies of that era did quite well too, because it was time to do some renewal. So it was a good time for software companies, eh?
Exactly, and but that just kind of gave me my first introduction into technology, into supply chain, right? How companies could use an enterprise system. And then I really peaked and was interested in the transportation side, and went to work for a company called Glog, which is now Oracle Transportation Management. Spent 11 years there. in different roles. And then I've been on the consulting side, helping implement software. The last 4 years before I getting to where I am now, I worked at a company called Project 44, built their entire global partner network. And so I think over the last 30 years in supply chain, last 25 years in technology, I just looked at it and said it's time to go do something else and take all my experience and move to the university where I teach now. So some people call it an adjunct professor. My title is actually lecturer, which is higher than an adjunct professor, which is interesting. And I'm the director of the Global Supply Chain Institute at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. So been here since February. Love it. Love teaching. Love, getting this next set of supply chain practitioners ready for the industry. And I'll be honest, working with this group of students, this age group, luckily I have two of those at UT right now. But it's very interesting in how this next generation of students interact. And so it's a lot different than when I went to school. Let's put it that way.
Before we jump to, feet first into all things supply chain, I'm curious about the experience moving from what I would kind of describe as from player to coach. And I think that's what you sort of describe. You've kind of spent time in the field acquiring these skills. But as we get older, we all do, and I am too. And I've also got older kids, and I actually read a book just recently, sort of about this premise of moving player to coach, like crystallized intelligence versus fluid intelligence is the idea. And as you kind of move into your older ages, you start thinking more critically about that coaching. How has that been for you? Have you found that transition going from being the doer to the teacher?
For me, it's been, well, I'll say it was kind of like, I jokingly say this, but it was like PTSD for the first 4 months. I didn't wake up at 6 a.m. and grab my cell phone and start looking and saying, okay, what hot issues out there? What do we got to solve? What's going on with the partner? Those type of things, right? It was definitely a more laid back atmosphere. And where I'm going with this is that going from that doer to a coach, you're now creating your own schedule.
Yeah.
And you can then put more thought into how you want to plan that out and how you want to frame out these things. For me, going into that classroom and being a coach is not about me coming in and teaching theory to students, because they've already had that. I've got seniors, right? I've got their last year of undergrad. And what I'm doing now is taking what they've learned and putting and applying it to real world examples. So I'm lucky because I'm teaching supply chain information technology, which is my wheelhouse. And so I'm exposing these students to everything from an ERP to a TMS to a WMS to digital supply chain, what that means. And now we're about to start database design, and they will learn to write SQL. And so for me, it's giving them real world examples of how this data works and this theory they've heard about of a digital supply chain. So what I do is I bring in guest speakers, and we have a lot of topics, and we keep them engaged in hands-on learning experiences, because the last thing a kid or a young person now, a student wants to get.
They're kids to you, eh?
Yeah, they're still kids to me.
Yeah.
The last thing that they want to do is get PowerPointed to death. And unfortunately, I teach at 6:10 p.m.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and they've been there all day. So you got to keep it. You got to keep the energy going.
So you mentioned that supply chain was a term as you got into the industry that didn't exist. It's been created sort of over this last 25 years, we'll say. Digital supply chain is sort of a newer add-on to that as things have started to go. So, and you talked about this is something you're teaching, this is something you're focusing on. What are you teaching about that? Like, what is somebody coming into, and maybe it's simple. Maybe this is something that we all take for granted, but let's just ask it so we can kind of go to first principles and build from there. Like, what is a digital supply chain?
Yeah, so great question. Digital supply chain is really the framework of how the data actually powers the supply chain. So if you think about, it's the overarching, or it's the underpinning of allowing a supply chain to function or execute. And it's allowing it to be integrated. So we're talking about integration of data, how I can use that data in all areas of the supply chain. So for instance, at the University of Tennessee, we teach supply chain as in source, plan, make, deliver. And those are 4 different modules, right, in supply chain. And all 4 of those are going to either have an enterprise system that's involved to manage that, or it's going to have an enterprise system with some best of breed applications around it. But they've got to be integrated, and they've got to be able to share that data across the supply chain in order to be efficient. The perfect example that I give is the terms where we talk about having a supply chain that is basically a living supply chain. And what I mean by that is the data is as real time as it can get. How do I use that data? And can I make better decisions? So it's funny, I just gave my first exam, and one of the questions is why do you want your supply chain management system to be fully integrated with your CRM, so with your customer relationship management system? And the answers I'm reading are pretty interesting, but all in all, it's about understanding, over on the supply chain side, what's my customer doing? What are the demands from my customer? How do I take that demand and forecast for inventory? And then if you think about from a transportation side, how do I give that data back to my customer to make them have a better experience and understand what's going on with the supply chain? What shipments are in trouble? What shipments are on time? Those type of things. So it's all about the data. And I think what that does is that really gets us to a point where we can be more efficient in our supply chain because we're using the data in the correct way.
So one of the, I think the challenges, you've heard the term, and again, even based on sort of some of the companies you've worked with, this would have come up just in the eras in which that you would have been there. Specifically, I'm thinking of Project 44, just the time that I know that company's been around from and what you would have been doing there. And so I'm going to just venture a guess to say right around that time that you were with P44, the term supply chain orchestration was really hot for a while. And the idea is that it's this connected tissue that runs through various and disparate systems from farm to mouth, all sort of through a single pane of glass. I do not know of a product that's been able to actually do this yet. I know many that have failed in it, and I don't blame them, because I think so my question in this is like that still today feels at scale impossible. But what are you seeing that may allow for something like that to be possible?
Yeah, so I think really, if you go back and look, and when visibility got hot, it got hot because of COVID. And we got caught during COVID of where's my shipment? Where's my inventory? You guys up in Canada felt it just what we felt it in the US here. Like we ran out of toilet paper, right? We ran out of flour. We ran out of all these different goods. And you're like, okay, if I can't buy it here, I'll go and search for it here. And if I can't find it online, maybe, this store will have it. Well, at the end of the day, as a consumer, normally what we look at that and we say that's a bad delivery experience, right? And so if I think back to the word you just talked about, connective tissue, visibility is that. And I've got to connect so many different trading partners in the supply chain. So if I think back to, I'm a TMS, for instance, and one that you know very well, let's say Rose Rocket, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm a TMS, and I'm going to create my shipment, and I'm going to push that off to my carrier. And then my carrier is going to accept the load, and then my carrier is going to move that down the road, and I'm going to have to track that carrier. And then I want to feed that information back, and okay, I'm getting that information. So I'm connecting, I'm building a connection between my visibility platform and the TMS. I'm building a connection between the visibility platform and the carrier. And this is a very simple example.
Yep.
And I'm going to take that information and I'm going to push that back to all the relevant parties that need to have access to that information. So there's a value in being that visibility platform. There's also a value of me pushing that information back to a system of record. And in that example, it would be the TMS. Or in a greater example, it could be an ERP. It could be to SAP, it could be to Oracle, it could be, whatever the ERP is, or it could be another best of breed application. So I really think that, that's the simplest example. Where I think companies jumped on the bandwagon of that and said, okay, is that going to help me give a better delivery experience to my customers? And then in a B2B environment, is it going to help me give a better experience to my customer, just so that I can make sure that they understand and have the data to not impact their supply chain? So for instance, a great example of that be that you and I are in a transaction, you rely on me to give you a material. So I'm your supplier and I'm shipping you something. And if it doesn't get there in time, you're going to shut your production facility down. And that's going to cost you millions of dollars potentially. And then because on the inbound could affect the outbound, because the products you're going to make could be direct store delivery, direct to consumer, or it could be sent downstream for another assembly. And if you think about that from that standpoint, that data is very important but the question is, we're at a point now, and I challenge everyone that says, I want to kick off this initiative. I say, first off, do you have the right data strategy? How are you going to capture the data? And then what are you planning to do with the data? Mm-hmm. Because data today is the new oil, right? And we have to figure out how to refine the data. And just like we do with oil, but we've got to refine the data, and we got to make sure that we apply that data in the right way, because it could impact us to a point of having to change a business process. It could be as simple as, hey, I'm understanding that I'm using these carriers and I'm having service failures with these carriers, so I need to kick them out. Or I have this one supplier that I pick up from every time, and this supplier always causes my carrier to have a detention charge. And so I need to be on the side of my carrier here and work with my supplier. So we have to look at that, I think, with a 360-degree view and say, how are we going to use this data all across the supply chain? And then what's it mean, back to that example I gave you, if it's late, what's the impact to you? Does it impact your warehouse? Does it impact a labor force? Does it impact a production line? Does it impact you downstream? So I think companies really have to think about it from that standpoint. That's why I think the companies that are really successful doing this look at it from that view, and also are taking that data and thinking about it more than just an execution problem or a solution. They're looking at saying, how can I use this data upstream in my production planning or my supply chain planning, because I can see where my inventory is? How am I using this downstream in my BI platform, my analytics, and actually turning that into something? So that data then becomes gold, right? And I think those are the winners of this, back to this connective tissue. Hopefully that answers your question. And I'm sorry I went so long on that, but I'm very passionate about this topic.
I'm going to make you talk more on it. So, there's a lot in there. So is the idea, so I'd like to actually, there was something that I pulled from that when we're thinking about visibility, because this is funny, visibility in of itself is sort of it's almost become a subjective term, right? So someone's like, I'm looking for visibility. You're like, do you want to see where the truck is? Is it a data thing? Is it a document thing? It's like, visibility means so much. And almost in a way, you almost kind of answered a question I was going to ask anyway, which was like, how do you define visibility? Like, what is because this thing about visibility, I think, is funny in that it's a buzzy word. It has been for a while, and I would say even before COVID, but I would say that that definitely created more like, this is why you need visibility conversations. Right. But I would say that it's like I think largely had been early days, and I say this for someone who was really early in the visibility is valuable to the we'll call it the shipper for sake of just easy context here. And I was all over that, and very well, even before Rose Rocket. But it seemed at that time that visibility was simply, where's my freight? When will it be here? And it was like important when when it mattered, which honestly wasn't all that often. I broadly used to think of visibility as being an exceptionally overrated marketing concept because it only mattered in such rare times. And a lot of it, I watched a lot of technologies struggle going back maybe 10 years with kind of these visibility promises because it just, broadly speaking, didn't feel like anybody really wanted to pay for it. However, I think as the ability to reach deeper and visibility has taken on a more broad sense of what it means, because data, to your point, has become available, really, and workable and understandable. Visibility, I think, has actually become newly important because it's such a more broad term that means a lot of different things. And sorry, there's a question in here. Like, I guess, how do you think about visibility and the importance of visibility?
Yeah, and I agree with what you're saying. It's a lot more than just, hey, where's my shipment?
Yeah.
And I think that's really where it started. And it's more about, you only care about that when something goes wrong. So when I have, an issue, or I think we're at a point now with machine learning, can we get to a point of predict when we think things are going to go wrong? Or what's that high confidence rate that I'm running this origin and destination on this itinerary? And there's a high probability that based on the last 5,000 shipments, we're probably at a 67% rate that it might not be on time. So knowing ahead of time, I think that helps. But I think visibility, the power of visibility and the power of data now is getting to a point where it's helping us create agile supply chains. And that everybody talks about resiliency and resilient supply chains. But resiliency to me means that, hey, you can survive. I can take a blow and I can survive. But agile means I can take that blow. If I think back to the football terms, the NFL terms of the bend but don't break defense, I'm sure you've heard that term. That to me means I've got an agile supply chain. I can take a blow over here. I can have a disruption, but I can respond. And if I've got the right data, I can respond in the right way or in a different way, right? Where I think we saw visibility expand was it's not just about an LTL shipment or a truckload shipment. We started looking at it from a different modal perspective. So can I get visibility on my ocean shipments? Can I get visibility on my rail shipments? COVID's a perfect example when the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach had 100 ships hanging off of it, and I could have my shipment could be there for weeks. But technically an ocean carrier might say it had arrived. And if I'm actually tracking the ship, I can see that the ship did not make it to the terminal and did not make it to the berth. So I know my container is not off the boat yet, right? Mm-hmm. And that's great information to have. And then I can start assessing the impact of that downstream into my supply chain. A perfect example would be Suez Canal when Ever Given got stuck. Every one of those customers that had freight on that boat or that ship were impacted. And the question is, did they get an alert? Did they have visibility into that? And how did they use that data to make decisions in their supply chain? Some were really impacted because I know that because at the time, the company I was working for, those were some of our customers, and we were able to give them that data and let them make some decisions. There were others that probably didn't find out about it until they saw the news and probably went and said, "Oh my gosh, is my container on that ship?" So I think again, in the right way, in the right context, I think this could be a very powerful tool. And it can help me power my supply chain, and it can allow me to be agile.
When I think about, thank you for that. When I think about the, so you hear this kind of idea, or maybe not, maybe this is just my own head, but it's like, I think about, as we're talking about these things, you're talking about companies that have visibility into freight on a container that's, in the Suez Canal, that's like, this is stuck, ping, where it is. It's like, it feels still in some ways like future state in some like, it's like, I get the, that some businesses are experiencing that, or you were just describing earlier companies using, forward cast predictions and data lakes and like all these. And I get that there's sort of the the enterprises that are ahead on that, but it still feels, and this is where I mean this when I say this, it feels like a lot of companies that I go into or a lot of people I talk to still aren't actually doing that. They're still not there. They're on their way. They know it's possible. They're having, digital strategy meetings about these things. They're having, they're like,
Oh, yeah.
there's no shortage of building digital twins, and like you can come. Every company's got an initiative surrounding something like this. But like when you're thinking about in the field, how many companies do you think are? I don't know how to word this question. I'm trying to give some context to the listeners to say like, hey, things are changing. Get on this, but you're not like dead because you haven't done this yet. But like, I'm trying to get a sense of like how far along are we in the change from analog to digital? Would you say in the supply chain?
I think so. I think we're pretty far in regard to, it depends on how you define it. Have companies gone from using Microsoft Excel as their TMS to actually implementing a cloud-based TMS, SaaS-based model, right? And truly managing their freight in a TMS. So that would be one example. Are they implementing an ERP to manage multiple processes across their business? The answer to that is yes, we're seeing that. We're seeing an uptick in TMSs that are being purchased, and that could be across the industry, right? Whether it's for a carrier, and that goes back to a point of what's your definition of TMS, right? Is it a shipper-based TMS, a 3PL-based TMS, or brokerage? Is it a dispatch-based TMS for a carrier, et cetera, or all of the above? So I think we're seeing that. We're seeing adoption of that and continue to see adoption of that. So to me, that means we're becoming digital. The visibility piece was an add-on to that, because the visibility piece, actually, if you think about it in the example of, I've got a sports car, and this car, I've got this BMW, for instance. I really don't, but I'm just giving an example. And I look at this BMW and it says you have to put 93 octane petrol in it because you want the best performance from that engine. And if you put 87 octane in it, it might kill the engine. It's definitely not going to get the performance you want. And I paid a lot of money for this car. And so when I push the accelerator and I get on the motorway, I want performance. I want to hear that engine purr, right? And I could probably only give this example for another 10 years once everything goes electric, right? And the whole idea of that is that fuel is the data. And the data being that I used to say, and I still say this, the data from a visibility platform, or any way I can get the data from a carrier or whatever the case may be, I'm just using that as fuel to power my supply chain or power my TMS. So for instance, I used to make this argument that the data that I could get from tracking a shipment wasn't about, it was the fuel to power that engine, because I did the majority of my business process in my TMS, or I do the majority of my business process in my ERP. I don't need a third-party application to go out to have to do all this. So I'm looking for this way, this conduit to provide this data or this fuel into this engine that I work with. And so I think we are beginning to see that idea, and we're beginning to see people adopt that. Now, where, back to your point though, I still think there are companies that have jumped on this and did not have a good strategy in place when they started this journey. And that goes back to what I said before. What is your data strategy? How are you going to use the data? And what are you going to do with the data, right? How will you capture it? What will you do with it? If you have that strategy in place and you thought that through first, then it will mirror into which applications do I need and how am I going to get the ROI of this? Because this stuff's not cheap. And these, it's not one and done. You got to have people to manage this. I have to have people to manage the process, and I have to people to continuously being looking to do things in a better way. So continuous improvement plans. So I think I personally know several companies that have implemented this, and I've talked to chief supply chain officers. That's the beautiful thing about being in the Global Supply Chain Institute, I get to have conversations with chief supply chain officers and CTOs of these companies about digital strategy, digital transformation. And, I've heard really great stories. I've also heard where companies are struggling.
Mm-hmm.
And they struggle because they don't go into it with eyes wide open to understand everything it takes. I mean, a simple thing would be, hey, I've got 150 carriers I work with. How am I going to get those carriers connected? How am I going to get data in a better way than a 214?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I want to know, but do I technically really need to know that a truck's en route every 18 minutes? No, I don't. I just want to know when something happens, good or bad, right? Just give it to me in more of a real-time fashion than getting stuck in EDI land and me getting a batch update or me getting another update that came in and overwrote the other one and it was wrong. So again, it's how are you going to use that data?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if I was a consulting company tomorrow and somebody said, "Hey, I'm going to buy a TMS and a visibility platform, and I'm going to do this," first thing I would say is, "That's great. What problems are you trying to solve, and what's the whole idea behind this?"
Yeah. Yeah, these are simply tools, right? So it's like if you're going to go and build a house, you don't buy I'm not really handy, so I'm coming up with like a bad analogy here. You don't buy a guitar. I don't know why I came up with that, but you need to. So I'm sitting in a room staring at one. You need to have the problem to solve and let the tools enable you to solve the problem. But I really like this concept, and this is kind of the thread that's keeping this conversation consistent, and the kind of thread I'm pulling on here is that it's data informs the strategy, but in some ways, actually, data is the strategy. And I say that because it's like you're trying to, there's almost this phased approach to this. As you're saying this, I'm thinking this through. It's like this phased approach of how are you going to get the data, right? Like even there's that initial thought. It's like, because I kind of empathize with people who are saying, okay, I know I need to make a change in my business. I know I need to upgrade my technology because it's kind of almost back to your BMW example. It's like you said, it's not going to matter in 10 years because you need an electric car. You're kind of going to get there in 10 years and say, okay, I know I need an electric car, but like this car kind of still works and it's probably not performing the way it's supposed to. And I don't totally know why, right? Because it's like, and I say this oftentimes to people here in kind of the sales idea, like, when you're trying to qualify someone who might be buying a TMS and you ask them what the need is and they say, I want to modernize my business. I'm like, that's not a need. That's not a thing. And so I guess, how do you help somebody? We all know, and you and I both as technologists really know, and we're probably a little bit biased here, but we believe that technology is an unlock to scalability. But how do you help somebody get to the point where they just simply say, like, what's the first thing I do? How do I do this? How do I define the first thing I need to do?
Well, the first thing I would say to that is, where are the pain points in your business? And okay, yeah, I want to digitize my business, or I want to move to the latest and greatest, right? The first thing I would say is, where are the pain points in your business? And those pain points could be that, hey, my on-time delivery sucks to my clients, and I'm worried about market share, worried about losing my clients. Okay, that could be one. Number two could be, I'm sitting here thinking, I don't need 17 people to be planning shipments and calling carriers and doing all this because I went to a conference and I saw this new stuff and blah, blah, and I heard this guy speak. That could be another thing. It could be that I'm really having a big issue paying my carriers because their freight bills are always wrong. And I'm sitting here and I'm having to use a lot of FTEs in the back chasing paperwork. I don't get the bill of lading. I don't get the POD. The rate's wrong. Those type of things.
I come from the LTL background, so that one hurts. That one hits me right in the heart. Yeah, got that one.
Yeah. So I mean, again, where are the pain points in the business? Oh. And I'm talking about in this situation just as a TMS. And you need to apply those principles when you're looking at any technology. whether it's a WMS, order management system, an ERP, supply chain planning tool. I mean, any of this. And you need to look at it because you then have to create a justification and then start saying, when am I going to get an ROI? Right? When am I going to get the payback on this? And what are the drivers behind that? So is that going to allow me to do this in a more efficient way, meaning less FTEs? Not really eliminating jobs, kind of repurpose them to other areas of the organization? Or is it truly, it will be cost cutting? Is this going to allow me to pay carriers faster? And, we've seen this, right? We've seen the whole crunch of can't find capacity. There's too much capacity. It goes through waves, right? And how am I going to be able to strike up a deal with my carriers to where they actually want to work with me? And if I'm paying my carrier on time or paying these carriers faster, then I'm probably going to either get potentially a better rate, but I may get better service because they may put, my freight might be prioritized compared to someone else's freight. So I think, again, you have to look at that. You have to look at there's a trade-off. You have to look at the costs and the pain points. Then you have to look at the output and the ROI. And some of that might be because you want a competitive advantage. And let me also premise on this. It's interesting that a lot of times, I'll pick on brokers for a minute. Brokers will say, okay, I'm going to buy this TMS. And one broker will be like, well, I don't want to share. And this is in 3PL the same way. I don't want to share that I'm using TMS X because that's my competitive advantage. Well, it's actually not. Your competitive advantage is your process, how you do everything in your four walls. This TMS helps you do that. And if anything, I would want more people using that TMS because a rising tide lifts all boats, and I'm going to get better functionality, and I'm going to keep this company in business, and my operating system will be there, and I won't have to go and change it out because the company went belly up or the company doesn't have the functionality I need. So I think technology does a great thing there, but at the end of the day, the secret sauce is about what your process is.
I like that. Talk to me a little bit about sustainability. I know this is something you're talking to your students about, and I'm actually just curious about a lot of it, because I will tell you my general impression with let me narrow that in. Not sustainability as a holistic conversation. Sustainability as it applies to supply chains, and the way I'm actually thinking about this in my head, and you can kind of take this a different direction if you want, but I think about it in relationship to consumer brands saying we are working towards a net neutral organization, carbon net neutral organization, which would really, a lot of that emission would be happening within the supply chain. So ergo, we're looking for a net neutral, obviously, supply chain. That feels like a very nebulous thing to me to track, to be, I don't want to say purposefully misleading, but I'm going to just throw something out there. I get organic blueberries from Costco that are the size of my head. Now, I'm not saying,
I do too. Yeah.
I'm not saying, but I'm just saying, right? So it's hard to trust these organizations, broadly speaking.
Yeah.
And this stuff feels like greenwashing to me. And I would love your kind of opinion, feedback, and what's going on in that space, because it feels like a bunch of bullshit, if I can just be honest.
Yeah. And a lot of that is, but I will tell you that when you start thinking about CO2, net zero pledges and things of that nature, so there's 3 different types of emissions that you can measure: Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Scope 1 are the emissions that you can manage. It's the electricity, that's everything associated with powering your plant and those type of things, right? You can measure that. You can figure out what's your electric bill, all these things. Scope 2 would be an example. That would be, I have my own fleet of trucks and I run my own fleet. So therefore I know what my, emissions are. And also I can I'm going to be better off if I buy newer trucks, right? Because I've got newer engines that are be more efficient. Scope 3 is really, if you think about the shipper who is using a carrier, they can't control that. The carrier controls those emissions. A broker is a perfect example. Brokers use 20, 30, 40,000 carriers. And, they just use these carriers and they really don't know, for the most part, what's that carrier running down the road?
100%.
What's that truck, right? So we get to that point. You've heard of the EPA SmartWay program, I'm sure.
I have.
In the U.S. EPA SmartWay program, I'm going to be biased when I talk about this because the EPA SmartWay program is one of those things where they say, okay, sign up for this. It has about 3,500 carriers, and they're over 300 or 400, 380, 450,000 carriers right now. So what percentage is that? Very, very small. There is a lot of red tape involved to get into the SmartWay program. It takes about 70 to 80 hours to fill out the paperwork. So do you think that the majority of carriers, which by the way are less than 50 trucks, make up the majority of our carriers on the road? If you're an owner, are you going to waste 80 hours of your time to be a SmartWay program certified? Or are you going to take that 80 hours and apply that to your business in other areas to try to get your business rolling? We did that from a standpoint of talking to carriers, and they said, yeah, we don't see a benefit in being SmartWay program. SmartWay program also doesn't necessarily look at every asset a truck has. Now they will give you a score from 1 through 5. And so if you're in their program, they're going to tell you as a shipper or a broker, hey, Thomas's Trucking scored a 5 because Thomas's Trucking is certified and we've got their information. They submitted their information on an annual basis. That's key. So once a year, I have to submit my information. There are some other indexes, and one of our professors at the University of Tennessee, Dr. Alex Scott, has been working on an index now for, 8-10 years. And so he looks at it from multiple data sources and captures this and updates this index monthly. And he has about 90% of all the carriers in the U.S. in his database. And he's got over 2.5 million assets in his database. So he's got those mom and pop carriers and everything in there. And he's come up with a way to look at it using GLEC standards, saying, what is the CO2 output of a carrier at a carrier level, and then break it down by asset. Now, it's very interesting because a lot of companies are coming and saying, hey, I want this information because we're being forced to put a program in place to limit our scope 3 emissions, or to at least report on them for now, right? Let me understand. So it goes back to that original what we were talking about first. You can't measure it if you don't have the data and understand what you're measuring. And then so now I'm getting the data, and now I'm able to give information associated with this. Can't just put a mandate on someone and say, you're going to be carbon zero, you're going to be zero net free carbon by 2040. Okay, well, how are you going to do that? And you go, and a lot of companies are going to supply chain now saying, you've got to do this. You've got to help us with scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. In scope 3, you're using all these carriers over here, and you have no idea if that truck is a 2012 or a 2022.
That's right.
And so if I have a tool like this Fleet Sustainability Index, I can go in and I can begin to get data on this. And I could capture this data, and then I can begin to start creating a report, and I might start shifting my business process at that point.
So can I ask a question there?
Yeah.
Are shippers willing to pay for this?
That's still the great unknown, my friend. Now,
I feel like I know the answer.
Well, yeah, most are going to, everything's great until we have to put a cost associated.
That's right.
But what we are seeing is that, as you know, companies in Europe have been mandated to report this. There is legislation in the EU that they have to report this, and they have to. And so if it's a company that's headquartered in the EU that has a business unit in the US, they have to follow the same rules. They're having to report back to the homeland, right? To
So
the mothership.
Nestle is a good example of something like
Nestle, Unilever, others,
that.
right?
Right.
But then we're seeing other big companies in the U.S. that are headquartered in the U.S. that have operations across the globe. They're having to abide by that too, because if they've got offices, if they've got manufacturing facilities and everything, let's say in the EU, they're going to have to report on this. Now, we're beginning to see it in the U.S. And you may say, how? California, the governor of California has on his desk right now legislation that is passed that companies going with shipments coming out of California, going into California, or intra California, moving on a truck, will have to report their scope 3 emissions. And that's the first of several progressive states that might move that way. So I'm telling you, it's coming.
Yeah.
The SEC has been batting this around, saying, okay, companies, when you report your earnings on your 10K, you may have to report your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So I think it's coming. It's just a matter of when, and also depends on who the who the president's going to be, quite frankly.
Very cool. I think just as we kind of come to wrapping it up, and I think so, a lot to do there, but I'm very I'm encouraged by that, to be honest, just as a kind of where I sit in the world and in my opinions. And I know that makes things difficult, and I also know that trucking companies are under a lot of various pressures. Just the general sort of ESG space and carbon space, there's a lot of different things coming at them, and so I have empathy for those companies. I know, and operating in California seems to get trickier and trickier with each passing year. So, but good on California in a sense too, for also leading some of these initiatives and having the nerve to kind of put themselves out there and be the first to start these things. So I think that's probably good news long term, but it won't come without a bit of a bit of friction, I imagine. I do want to ask before we wrap up. What are maybe talk to me a little bit about what somebody learns at the supply chain course through that. Like, what would someone expect? So, as a student going into this is sort of an opportunity to kind of plug the supply chain program in, what students are coming out with, and what kind of work they're looking to get into, and just maybe kind of give me a quick little spiel on the program itself at your university.
Yeah, absolutely. But before I do that, I just want to go back to the one thing on the fleet sustainability index,
Sure.
because I want to point out that if you think back to the EPA SmartWay program, all those small carriers, are not getting into that program. So if I'm a shipper and I say I'm only going to work with SmartWay carriers,
yeah,
you have really limited the pond you're fishing in.
Yeah.
And if I then can be able to say, I still have that data, I can understand that a lot of these carriers may be clean. And if I can get this data out of this fleet sustainability index, then I'm fishing in the ocean compared to this pond. And I think that's important, because I don't want to leave those carriers out.
And you mentioned it earlier, and this isn't to like, turn SmartWay into a bad actor by any means, but it's also to suggest that it's a static point in time, right? So it's like, here's the trucks, here's the situation, cool. But a year down the road, or 8 months down, like, things change. So it's not exactly dynamic in terms of like, this is giving you a baseline and a comfort level, but it could be better. So I think that's a good call out.
Yes, and so to that last question, and thanks for letting me do this. Our students come in, and like I said before, they learn every aspect of supply chain, and we break it down to source, plan, make, deliver. So source means we actually start upstream from that, because we're closely tied to marketing to understand demand. So they learn business principles their sophomore year and then into their junior year. And they then get into sourcing. So they learn about procurement, and they learn about procurement from the supply chain side. They also learn about the transportation side, because there's a difference, right? Sourcing materials versus rates and carriers. And then I'm into planning. So they understand the whole principles of how to plan, how to do supply chain planning, etc. And then the make piece is the manufacturing. What's that entail? And then we get into the deliver. And so that's the transportation piece. That's the delivery. That's, from the make to the delivery, there's the warehouse component, or the warehouse components on the front end too. And then they're also really heavily involved in the IT side. So they're taking a class like I teach, but they're also taking a lot of analytics classes. These students are coming out with principles and understanding of how to use Power BI, how to use Tableau, and how to write SQL. So they understand data principles, database design, those type of things. They also understand the principles of digital supply chain. Mm-hmm. And then they also have to do at least a minimum of one internship, or they can't graduate. And we have students that are doing 2 to 3 internships. And they're also having, we used to call it, when I was going to school, a minor. Now it's called a collateral. But a lot of our supply chain students will have a collateral in data analytics or business analytics. And those are the students that companies are just really gobbling up. And we just had our career fair, and we had about over 200 companies on campus. And those companies are sourcing for internships and full-time employment. And I can tell you that we've got 1,486 students right now in our supply chain program.
Wow.
We're the largest major in the entire university system. And we've got, well into the high 90% employment rate with these students when they come out.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah, they're a hot commodity.
Yeah, this is an industry that's not that is hungry for talent right now, and it just doesn't seem to be slowing down. So it's a very, if you're looking for a career, this is one that will continue to expand and offer you challenges, really indefinitely. This is just, we're just getting started in many ways in what supply chain is and could possibly be. Thomas, I really want to appreciate. I know it took us some time to get together here, but it was really worth the wait. So thank you for joining us today. That was enlightening and a great conversation. So, thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. I appreciate it. I just honored to be on your podcast. So, look forward to hearing more from you and your guests, and then also, later down the road, keep me in mind. Maybe we'll do an update in a year.
I'd love to do that. Thank you for the offer. We'll certainly take you up on it. And for all our rabid listeners, be sure to like, subscribe, and push those buttons with the thumbs on it. Thank you, and be well.